Thank you very much for the introduction, Yolanda, and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. All the people that should have come will be kicking themselves when they hear about this. So you're the lucky you. We're going to we focused on the nuts and bolts of doing this trial and our experiences of working with community pharmacists in particular. So Michelle and I did this work probably about 18 months or so ago now, and we're still writing up some of the findings. So the findings we're presenting today are almost in press at the moment. They're with a journal, and we're confident the paper will be accepted very soon. So the findings are kind of hot off the press to some degree. Now, much as Michelle and I would like to take all the credit for this, in actual fact, this is part of a much bigger program of work involving a real range of collaborators from all sorts of different kinds of backgrounds, including patient representatives and representatives from the pharmacy profession. And probably of all the people we've worked with, I should think probably the UCL School of Pharmacy is probably the biggest hitter in terms of academic pharmacy in the country. And working with UCL has opened doors to us, not just in terms of the research itself, but also the kind of policy engagement work that accompanies this program of work. So what Michelle and I are going to do is sort of pass the baton back and forth a little bit, and just to give you a flavour of how doing a trial in this particular health setting worked or didn't work in some ways, and you'll be looking forward to hearing your perceptions and comments and questions about working with health professionals in community pharmacy, but also perhaps if you've got an interest in alcohol or other potentially sensitive topics or public health related topics that are very much within scope of community pharmacy. Now, Michelle, it's probably a good idea if you just told us a little bit about the York Trials Unit, because when I say the University of York, that's just not just the sort of the alcohol research, but also we work very closely with the York Trials Unit in conducting this work. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Duncan. Hello to everyone. Lovely to virtually meet you. So as Duncan says, my name is Michelle Watson. I'm a research fellow at York Trials Unit, which is part of the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. The York Trials Unit is a very multidisciplinary team. There's over 100 of us now. We've grown quite a lot in recent years, and are made up of statisticians, judges, trial coordinators, administrators, health economists, data managers. There's many different streams to people's roles there, and we provide a number of services based on that. So we've got data management and statistics services, economic evaluation, we offer randomization services for studies, trial coordination, which is what I've done previously, study design. So all sorts of different services involved in coordinating clinical trials and other studies. And we also support studies across a range of specialties, including education, a range of health conditions, mental health and addiction, musculoskeletal conditions, screening and prevention programs, and surgery. So as you can tell, we're quite a diverse unit in what we can do and the topics that we try and work with. Thank you, Duncan.
Great. So before, I should probably just pick up on what Michelle's saying, because it's probably important to stress that if you're going to do a trial in the NHS, you really can't do it without a trials unit, except in fairly exceptional circumstances these days. Now, we're lucky to have a trials unit within the University of York. Not every university has one, but nevertheless, if you were ever thinking of doing any kind of trial in the NHS, you would need the involvement of York Trials Unit, particularly if it's going to be funded by the National Institute of Health Research, which is the funder for this programme. of work. You know, and you know what you're buying as such is expertise in doing trials. So Michelle's been very modest. She didn't really. You know, her personal contribution is really important to this work, because essentially she was the representative of the York Trials Unit in the research team, and was responsible for the kind of implementing the design of the study on the ground and ensuring that the data collection process ran smoothly, etc. So all the data from this trial, all the quantitative data, went to the trials unit for independent analysis. So we didn't do that. We just looked at some qualitative data that we collected alongside. So you know, we can pick this up in the discussion. But if this is the kind of research you want to do, it's worth picking Michelle's brain while you've got the chance. And something to bear in mind, you know, if you're costing doing a trial, you know, it's fair to say that trials units don't come cheap. You know, so you are buying, you know, expertise in doing trials, but you could probably expect the cost to sort of match all the other costs that you've accrued in the study. You know, in terms of collaborators and non-staff costs, etc. You know, you're essentially doubling the amount of money you're likely to need to be able to conduct the study. So it's a big investment, which is why probably trials in the NHS tend to be quite expensive, even ones of modest scale like this. So if you want to explore that a bit more, then do ask some questions at the end. Right, so I'm going to give you some background really to why we're doing this research in the first place before we move on to the details of the study itself. So we all know, you know, about community pharmacies, and actually 9 out of 10 people actually within 20-minute walk of a community pharmacy. And I don't know about you, but sometimes you walk down the high street and there seem to be several of them, often a few feet apart. You know, so they are you know, a really strong presence in terms of you know, accessible healthcare, and that really is their unique selling point. You know, they're a walk-in service. You don't need an appointment for most of the services provided in a community pharmacy, and you know, this is something that the pharmacy profession is very proud of. You know, so it's something that they promote as a unique selling point for community pharmacy, particularly in the context of general practice. You know, so if you can't, you all know how difficult it can be to get an appointment with a general practitioner at the best of times. We won't mention what it's like in the pandemic, but actually just being able to walk down the road and go and ask for some advice is really important. And this is what pharmacists themselves really value in terms of the service they provide. Now, community pharmacies aren't just about dispensing, of course, and actually they do have a strong and increasing public health function. So they now provide a range of clinical services, which, you know, such as sexual health services, smoking cessation, indeed some alcohol-related services, and a range of others actually that are designed to integrate into other NHS services. So you kind of get a more seamless healthcare process for individual patients. So that's how community pharmacy sees itself in terms of its identity within the broader NHS. But perhaps the most important thing to stress for this talk is to remind ourselves that these are businesses. They're contracted to provide NHS services. You know, so some of them are part of large multiple chains like Boots, for example, Lloyd's Pharmacy, but some are independents as well, so they're standalone businesses. This is really important because it's, you know, not only is it unusual in terms of doing health research, particularly in the NHS, you know, this makes them slightly different from most other services, but actually it has an influence on the culture of community pharmacy. So it's very unlike doing work in general practice or in hospitals, for example, Here, because their businesses, money is really, really important. And I might be doing them a disservice by saying it's kind of foremost in their mind, but actually you can't do a thing in community pharmacy without some kind of payment. And from a research perspective, that means you pretty much can't walk through the door unless there's money on offer. So, for example, in this work, we needed to get pharmacists out of the pharmacy, so we can do various bits of training with them. And in order to do that, we needed to be able to give them money to pay for local pharmacists to fill the gap. And they wouldn't actually participate in the study without an upfront payment, as a sort of recognition of the disruption that was likely to occur. So, in a way, research is kind of a business opportunity, so you can make a bit of money out of it. So you do have to provide some recompense, financial recompense, for their involvement in it. The other aspect of it is it just makes the whole governance and approval process much more complicated, because in addition to the NHS ethical approval and governance process, you've got these businesses that have their own mechanisms of doing that as well. So you have a sort of twin track approval process to navigate, and that can be fairly complicated, and we'll give some insight into that as we go. So I just wanted to let you know what these medicine review services are. These are the focus of this research, and there are two primary ones. The first is what's called a medicine use review, which is a sort of 10 to 12 minute structured review. Actually follows a template, and the idea is to talk to patients to help them manage their long-term conditions and their medicines more effectively. So in practice, this tends to be a kind of checklist of what people are taking, and some very simple questions about how they're getting on with them. And I guess the focus is probably on potential adherence issues as much as anything else. Unless a patient raises some particular problem or side effects, these reviews are over fairly quickly. And in fact, they're actually being phased out now. And this did have an impact on the patient recruitment in this pilot trial, because unfortunately, the decision to phase them out coincided with our research. The other one is a new medicine service. It does something very similar, but it's very specific to particular patient groups and conditions, and it's where they get a new medication. So where there's a change in their medication, and that's often comes from the hospital pharmacist. So if they're a cancer patient or have some other long-term condition and their medication changes, there's a follow-up arranged with the pharmacist just to check that no problems are emerging. And these reviews are very, very quick. It could be 5 minutes. And unlike the medicine use review, they're often done by phone as well. And these services entail costs. So for each one, I think it's £28 a pop for doing one. And there are various targets for individual pharmacies to achieve with these services. So those two medicine review services were the focus of our research. So I'm going to give you some background to the pilot trial itself now. So as I said, the research is funded by the National Institute of Health Research. It's a 5-year program of research. We're about 3 years into it now. The acronym is CHAMP, which stands for Community Pharmacy, highlighting alcohol use in medication appointments. So you can see why we needed an acronym. And alcohol itself, is actually within scope of community pharmacy provision, in the sense that, in the context of the public health function of community pharmacies, there is an encouragement to ask people about their alcohol consumption. and indeed to provide some brief advice about cutting down on drinking or signposting people to alcohol services if that's felt to be necessary. But importantly, there is no evidence for effectiveness of these kinds of services. And in fact, there's only been one trial of this kind of brief advice type alcohol intervention in community pharmacy, and it found a null effect. So this is why we were doing this research, because we think alcohol has an important place in community pharmacy service provision, but perhaps not in the way it's being delivered to date. So what we've done is developed a new approach to discussing alcohol within the context of medicine reviews. We've developed an intervention called the Medicines and Alcohol Consultation, or the MAC. And the idea is that when someone goes to a medicine review or a new medicine service consultation, it provides an opportunity for that individual to think about the consequences of their alcohol consumption in terms of the effectiveness of their medications and on their health more generally. And importantly, if you think that alcohol is just another drug, and it in fact interferes with many of the medications that people with long-term conditions are taking, it's actually detrimental to the effectiveness of their treatment. So this is why we think pharmacists are particularly well placed to have that kind of discussion with a patient during the course of a routine medicine use review. So the MAC is designed to be integrated into these routine medicine review services, and it's probably just best described as a person-centered consultation. So the idea is it's sort of based on motivational interviewing. Olive, you've got a question. I don't mind answer it now if you want. Have you got a question, Olive? I can't hear you if you have. Okay, I'll carry on. I can't hear if you've got a question or not. Can anyone else hear me? If you can hear me, can't you?
Yes, it's fine.
Good.
We
okay.
can hear you. Yeah.
Good. I'll come back, Olive. I'm not sure why your hand's up. If you do have a question, okay, don't worry. Don't worry. Yeah, so we designed this intervention, and it's loosely based on motivational interviewing principles. The idea is to help pharmacists avoid or resist the temptation of telling people what to do, telling people not to drink. We don't think that's the right approach at all. Rather, this intervention is about understanding people's motivations for drinking, where drinking fits in their lives. And so that involves listening very carefully to what patients actually say, and doing so with empathy. And actually, the idea is to then empower patients to make decisions about their own health, their own medications, their own drinking, through encouraging self-efficacy and self-management. So those are the broad principles. But the important thing about this entails a very different approach to these consultations. In fact, when we actually sat in on these medicine use reviews, and when I said a checklist earlier, it really is a fairly cursory investigation into people's use of medicines, and that's pretty much it. alcohol or anything else rarely features, and it seems like a missed opportunity, to actually put the patient at the centre of the discussion, rather than just following the sort of pharmacist-led agenda of a quick check of medicines. That kind of practice is not conducive to a proper discussion of alcohol, the way that might affect people's medicines and their health, and then giving people space to think about what changes they might want to make rather than telling them off, which is kind of the predominant approach in much of primary healthcare. So this entails quite a involved program of training and practice development support for pharmacists. So the principle is really that if you want to change people's drinking through this means, you actually need to change the practice and behaviour of pharmacists first, and this is what the MAC program is intended to do. So we train them to do things differently, and they have a kind of a guide that they use to structure the medicine review somewhat differently. So why did we need a pilot trial? Well, the kind of crescendo of this program of work, it was to do a definitive trial of the intervention, and then if it proved effective, then we'd work with the pharmacy profession to roll it out across the country. That was the idea. But of course, doing trials in any healthcare setting raises all sorts of uncertainties, and we were particularly concerned about the acceptability and feasibility of actually doing a trial in community pharmacy. You don't really find many trials of this sort in community pharmacy. We weren't quite sure how it was going to work. The trial design is a cluster randomised trial. So the unit of randomisation is the pharmacy, not the patient. And the reason for that is, if you think that we are training pharmacists to do something very differently, to really change their practice, it's not feasible to ask them to conduct a consultation with some patients using the new approach and some patients using the old approach. It's not really going to work. You're going to have contamination between groups. So the randomisation is done at the level of the pharmacy, and then patients in the intervention pharmacies, their pharmacists do the medicine review with the MAC, and then patients in the control pharmacies have routine care as usual. Now, within the trial, we included a qualitative process study, and we really wanted just to sort of understand how pharmacists got on with this practice development program, and also the experiences of the trial. And it's the latter that we're focusing on this seminar. So we're in this seminar, we're actually talking about how, by and large, how pharmacists got on with doing a trial, and some of the problems and dilemmas that the process posed for them. So if you're interested in the main trial results, the sort of the broader feasibility issues, then we published this towards the end of last year. It's an open access paper. It's available on if you just search my name on the university repository, it'll come up. It's published in BMC Health Services Research. So this sets out kind of the main indicators of feasibility and how we got on. We are going to touch on this in today's session because Michelle's going to talk a bit about the patient follow-up aspect, which is something that she actually was personally responsible for and did ever so well with. We did very well with her follow-ups, and she's going to just reflect on what that was like for her. So Michelle, could you give us an outline of the pilot trial design?
Absolutely, no problem. So, as is shown on the first sentence of the slide, the study is a multi-centre, cluster, randomised controlled pilot trial who aren't familiar perhaps with those terminologies, Duncan's already gone through some of them. So multi-centre simply means it's using several sites, several pharmacies in this case. Cluster, as Duncan has said, it randomises groups rather than individual patients. So in this case, it randomised the pharmacy. Randomisation, the process of, it's thought of as like if you flick a coin, you're going to get either heads or tails, but you don't know which. And with randomisation, that's the same concept. You're either going to get randomised to the control, the standard care, or the intervention, but you don't know which. And as Duncan said, it was a pilot trial. This was a small trial to help us to design and assess the feasibility, then leading to a larger definitive trial. We wanted to recruit 80 participants and up to 12 community pharmacists. Trials often aim for higher numbers because there's always a certain amount of loss to follow-up where you can't contact participants, or for whatever reason people drop out on the way. So you always want to consider going for more than what you need. And we also then randomised patients to the pharmacists to complete their MURs or NMSs, and they were randomised to either the usual control, which is no change to their MUR or NMS, or to deliver the MAP intervention, which Duncan has discussed previously. So in the end, we had 10 pharmacists, and we wanted to keep within a 1.5 hour travel range of York. So we stuck within the Yorkshire area, but we did want to consider different ranges per se. So we went for urban and rural environments. We approached independent and multiple pharmacies, and included pharmacies within various deprivation areas. So it makes it more generalisable, even though it was just within the Yorkshire area. So the 10 pharmacists screened and recruited patients, and screening and recruiting was a new process for the pharmacists, so we'll discuss that in more depth. We had 51 participants recruited, and our participants were those who were aged 18 or over. They were eligible for the MUR or NMS consultation, and they drank alcohol at least twice a week. We excluded patients who had had treatment for alcohol use in the last year. So then I followed up with participant by completing a telephone interview 2 months later. And there were challenges around this because firstly, they'd never met me. They'd been aware that I would call them to a study. They've been a participant information sheet which describes what's going to happen in the study, the benefits, any risks, and that sort of information. So they had been informed that I would call them 2 months later, but they weren't aware of my name, my background, anything like that. So that presents a challenge. And we were collecting data about various things. I collected the data using a form, so then that allows the data to be collected in a standardised way, which makes it easier for data to be processed and then analysis to be conducted. So we collected data about alcohol and depression. So they're quite sensitive issues, which was perhaps another concern. Would people be willing to talk to somebody they hadn't met before about such sensitive issues? Alongside collecting information about their confidence in their medication management, their medication adherence, and their quality of life. Alongside this, the team also conducted interviews with participating pharmacists, as Duncan's mentioned previously, and that was to find out more about their thoughts and their experience being involved in the study. And we'll go into that in a few slides' time. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm just going to describe the pharmacist recruitment process, and actually just I mentioned the sort of the governance issues earlier, and this was actually more involved, I guess, than we probably anticipated at the beginning, because when you think about the nature of the intervention, which is really about practice development and a profound change to practice. We were actually looking for community pharmacists who are really motivated to engage in that kind of process. So really committed to it and actually genuinely had capacity to participate. So I think it's fair to say at the outset, that isn't probably representative of most community pharmacies, probably. So we were looking for a particular type of community pharmacist, but necessarily so because this wouldn't work for someone who's just not that into the idea of really reflecting on the way they practice and being committed to changing it. So we did it in multiple steps, and I'll just describe what they are, just in case you have an interest in doing this kind of work, any kind of work with community pharmacies. So there are local pharmaceutical committee networks across the country, and these are sort of important professional bodies that have an influence on regional provision of community pharmacy services, and they have all sorts of links to general practices and commissioning groups in the various regions. So we went there first, and they're usually very helpful, and we advertised the study through them. And then if any pharmacist was interested, then we phoned them up to confirm their eligibility. Now that was based on whether they're going to be doing enough medicine use review and NMS consultations. So we didn't want people just doing a handful. For trial you generally need quite a lot of people. So they need to be doing a minimum, who had a really strong interest in practice development and were able to commit to taking part in intervention training if they were randomised to the intervention, but also all the pharmacists had to commit to doing a research training day. We would expect full availability of the pharmacists without any disruptions in the pharmacy during the period of the trial. And as I said earlier, each pharmacy was paid around £2,000 for taking part. So once we did that, we provided more information about what was likely to be involved. So we gave a general idea beforehand, but then we gave them the detail and really emphasised the level of commitment that we were looking for. So we followed them up again and called them up, and just to check that they really understood what was coming their way and the commitments required. We discussed managerial approvals, and if they hadn't already, we wanted to get that process going and to provide any information that may be necessary. Now, in practice, it's kind of interesting to note that certainly in Yorkshire and the North East, where this research has been done, the research lead for Boots, a chemist, was the go-to person for all the other pharmacies when it came to deciding whether to take part in research studies. So we quickly discovered that actually this individual within Boots was the person that had quite a lot of sway as to whether the research would likely go ahead or not. So fortunately they did support the research, but it was a kind of almost an accidental discovery, and it's indicative of some of the complexities of doing research in a business environment because they don't follow kind of the sort of standardized procedures that you might expect in the NHS. So once we had Boots on board, and ironically not a single Boots pharmacist actually took part in the trial in the end, but nevertheless, once you could say, well, Boots have approved it, the other pharmacies fell in line. As I said, we just had to double check that we had very specific training days by this time, and they had to commit to be able to come on April the 3rd or whatever it was. If they couldn't commit to that, they couldn't take part. And we needed to check if they were really willing to be randomised. And this is important because, we made a lot about the intervention itself and what was involved and what they might benefit from doing it. But only half the pharmacists were going to be receiving that intervention. And what we didn't want to happen is for pharmacists who weren't randomised intervention to then sort of just drop out. So they had to be willing to still take part in the trial, still recruit patients, collect data, even though they weren't getting the intervention itself. And then we made a final selection based on the responses to all these questions. And we selected 10 pharmacists, so one pharmacist per pharmacy, so they are. So that actually took quite a bit of time and a lot of legwork actually to kind of get to know the individual pharmacists and the culture and the processes of different types of, different companies and different types of pharmacies. Right, Michelle, can you describe the exciting pharmacist training day we have arranged for?
Absolutely. So the research training day was a great opportunity to get involved, to meet everybody, to put a face to a name. It was a really lovely and productive day. We didn't want to bombard people with too much information because a lot of these things, so it was very important to break up the topics, get tea and biscuits in between, especially important. So the pharmacists received an introduction to the study. Obviously, ahead of the training day, they were aware of details of the study, but this was more details and a chance to review what they've been told already. They received GCP, or Good Clinical Practice training, and that's a really important thing to undertake. It describes the responsibilities of everybody who's involved in the conduct of trials, and it ensures that participants are protected. So it's a core piece of training for people who are delivering research. It's a fantastic piece of CPD for pharmacists as well, and it's a piece of training that's valid for several years, so there's lots of positives to being involved in GCP training. And the pharmacists also received training on patient recruitment, again a new process to all of them. So it was a great opportunity for the pharmacists to have a look at and discuss the processes and the documents together, bearing in mind this was new for all of them. So we went through the eligibility and the recruitment processes, the study forms. So when we were recruiting participants, we gave envelopes that contained all of the study forms that needed to be completed, but it was just a chance to have a look through those, have a dummy run at filling them in, just so that people felt more comfortable with them ahead of actually starting the process. It gave everybody a chance to discuss how to approach patients, to introduce the study, and it was a great chance to have a discussion as to what we thought would work and what they thought would work, because obviously we can think things might work, but on the ground it might work differently. So it was a great chance to have those discussions and to obtain informed consent. This is the idea that participants of what will happen to them if they are involved in the research, the risks, the benefits, everything that's described in the information sheet, and they have to complete a form to confirm that they are happy to be involved in the study. So again, whilst consent procedures are in place in pharmacies for MURs and things like that, there's a good chance to have a look at the paperwork and the consent statements that were part of the study. All of the pharmacists received one-to-one support from the research team after the pharmacist training day and throughout the recruitment period, and this was in person and by phone. It gave us the opportunity to observe recruitment techniques when we went to visit them in the pharmacies, which allowed us to identify any barriers, problem solve whilst we were there, also discuss what had worked at other sites, which was a real help, set targets so that we could hit our recruitment target, and emphasise processes that had worked in other places. And the support was also to support the study participation and ensure that people were adhering to the protocols. So again, these were new systems that people were working to, and we wanted to make sure that we were being consistent across the pharmacies, so it allowed us to do that. The pharmacists who were delivering the intervention also received additional support. So this was to ensure that they were delivering the intervention as planned, and also to ensure that the practice was developed accordingly. Thank you, Duncan. So moving on to patient follow-up, this was something that I was responsible for. So we followed up participants with an interview which was completed 2 months after their MUR or NMS consultation with their pharmacist. It was mostly telephone. So there was a trained researcher, that was me, who participants met. I completed a study form during the discussion. So whilst we were having the telephone call, I was completing a study form and collecting the data, as I said, so that it could be standardised and then analysed accordingly. Participants were offered a £10 voucher as a thank you for their time. Some people didn't want it if you went to charity, which was very kind and generous of them. A few people were very keen to receive it. And we saw 47 of our 51 participants complete the 2-month follow-up, which we were really pleased with. That's 92% of our study population we were able to reach. So as I said earlier, most of it was completed by telephone. We managed to get 38 responses by telephone, which was 81% of our study population. And 9 of the follow-ups were completed by post, which represented 19%. So we tried to contact participants by telephone 3 times before we posted the form to them to complete themselves. We got most of the participants within the first or second attempt, and a few of our participants, 13% of them, we got at the 3rd attempt. So what helped us to contact participants? Some of these are going to seem like common sense, but they work. So obtaining 2 telephone numbers where possible. I guess you don't call yourself, so you don't often write your own telephone number down. There were a few errors along the way, so it was really handy to have 2 numbers in case one had either been written down wrong or for some reason it didn't work. Then asking participants for a preferred day or time to call. The participants are busy, they have hobbies, they're out at work, so finding out when they're free and then directing the call at that appropriate day and time really helped us. And they were just more likely to be able and willing to chat with you if you called them at a good time. I made all calls from only 1 telephone number so that they recognised that it was me. So if they had missed the call and I'd left a voicemail, then they would hopefully recognise that same number as me calling the next time that I rang. As I said before, making 3 attempts to contact the participants by phone before sending the form by post for completion, and also making sure that these calls were several days apart so as not to bother people. And with permission, leaving voicemails asking people to call me back at a more convenient time. So what helped us to complete data collection? I should say here that I'm also, alongside my role at the university, I'm also a pharmacy technician in an independent community pharmacy. So I get to chat with participants quite a lot. Sorry, I get to chat with patients quite a lot. And I wanted to consider what I speak to, what and how I speak to patients about, and then bring this into the study. And that helped me to think about what might help data completion. So it was things like a friendly introduction, remembering that this was the first time that they were speaking to me. They might perhaps want me to speak more clearly, they might want me to speak more slowly. Some people did have some hearing difficulties, so it was a case of perhaps speaking louder. So just being mindful of participants' needs. Then a reminder about the study. It's been 2 months since they had their discussion with their pharmacist, and just a brief overview to help them to remember that they were part of a study and what that study was about. Telling participants approximately how long the call would take. So I generally about 20 minutes, which allowed them to figure out if they had time to speak or if they'd rather reschedule the call. I always left longer between calls when I was scheduling them, because if participants wanted to talk for longer, I didn't want them to feel like I was abruptly cutting them off. So I never planned back-to-back calls, and I think that was important to allow participants to just chat to me, get to know me a little bit as well. Mentioning the £10 thank you voucher early in the call, we've got a few questions asking where it could be spent. So we use the one for all vouchers, which have multiple retailers on them. And people really seem to like that idea that it wasn't just for one shop and it spent online or in the shop. So that really helped. And finally, as I mentioned before, just giving participants time to speak outside of the topics that were related to. So if they wanted to tell me about their family, they wanted to chat about the weather that day, what they've been up to that day, allowing people time to do that and allowing that relationship to develop with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Oh, but there's some feedback. Don't know why. But thank you for that. And I think what Michelle just said, to me, when I was listening to Michelle's talk, it made me think about some of the benefits of working in the trials unit. Can anyone else hear the feedback, or is it just me? It must be just me. Okay. Yeah, so when you think about how difficult it is actually to get data in these kind of follow-up interviews, as Michelle said, they never met her before. And for a trial, what data is absolutely crucial. And so, if you're, what you're buying, one of the things you're buying from the trials unit is someone like Michelle who's expert in having these discussions with patients in a kind of gentle way that she describes, putting them at ease and enabling data collection to proceed. And let's say we emphasise alcohol's a sensitive topic. So I think goodness knows what the follow-up rates will be doing it. So I would just very grateful for having someone like Michelle who can bring her expertise to bear. It clearly did make a difference and an important contribution to the success of the trial. The remainder of I'm going to be talking about the experiences of the pharmacists involved in their research. And this is quite interesting. So I'll reflect back up to some of the things we've said up to now, but particularly around the research training, because that sets important context. Because we actually found that pharmacists in this trial had really limited research experience. They might have done a project while they're at university, but certainly hadn't done anything else, and certainly nothing like a trial. So they really were novices when it came to doing research. And I think this probably affected their expectations of what was likely to be involved. By the same token, they were really supportive of research being done in community pharmacy, and actually having done it, they were keen to recommend the experience to other pharmacists. So that was a kind of a positive outcome. But they did find it a burden, going back to the kind of the time is money thing I mentioned at the start. They were acutely aware throughout this research about the pressures of time and the consequences of that in terms of the business, but also the potential impact on patients. So this pharmacist, says, dare I say, there's enough to do at the moment in the day job, but adding in extra complexities, unless we can find time to decommission something else. In other words, they really struggled to fit the research procedures around everything else they did. So whilst the intervention itself, the pharmacist doing the intervention, that was compressed integrated within the medicine use review as routinely delivered. So it didn't, the time didn't differ that much. But what really was a burden for all the pharmacists was the extra time involved in screening patients for eligibility, going through the informed consent process, answering any questions the patients had about the research, and then filling in some data collection forms. They found that really, really challenging in terms of the time it took and the impact that then had on the rest of their practice. I should have probably said actually that what we did, we analysed the pharmacist interviews, and we identified these 4 themes. So that this is a kind of a thematic analysis. These are the broad themes that we kind of emerged from. on the analysis. So they found the whole thing really difficult, but they did value the training and the support, particularly the more practical aspects of it. So they all did really want to feel confident about what they had to do for the trial, and they enjoyed, aspects of the research training. We think the trial support visits were absolutely essential. So this is when we actually went to see what the pharmacists were doing and how they were actually recruiting patients. And we identified some problems really early on, which I think, if we hadn't done, would have really impacted on the whole study. So we noticed real inconsistencies in the way patients were introduced to the research, not following the kind of guidance that we have provided, and sometimes a bit clumsy and off-putting. So we wanted to get that right, because we'd actually developed a kind of a pitch with our patient advisory group, which we wanted the pharmacist to follow as closely as possible. We found the recruitment forms sometimes were incomplete, so we had to deal with that. So pharmacists were rushing through them and not filling in all the bits they needed to. We had unexpected pressures on the consultation rooms. So each pharmacy will have at least one private consultation room where these medicine reviews take place. But because the whole process was taking longer, people were in the consultation room for longer, and it had knock-on effects. There's actually quite a demand for that single room. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but they're a bit like broom cupboards with the sink often. I mean, they're very pokey, peculiar little rooms. It's not somewhere you want to be for very long. I think they're all very conscious of this. And they also had difficulty approaching all the medicine review patients that they were speaking to. The idea was they were going to approach everybody, and they weren't necessarily always managing to do that. So the support visit from our perspective made a big difference, but I think that was true of the pharmacists themselves. So this one, is affirming that actually it helped the recruitment forms. They'd actually thought they'd done them well, but there were a few things missing, important things missing, and having someone in situ to check in real time and to point these things out was really valued. In terms of recruitment procedures, as I said, I think time to recruit patients, was a consistent challenge. It took about 10 minutes. And that's actually at least as long as the medicine use review itself. And I had a real hang up about that. For some people, they couldn't actually do this unless there was another pharmacist covering them. It took so long. But most of them actually, and this is a common thing, they really are concerned about the impact on patients, and dare I say, the impact on customers. I think some pharmacists expressed it in that kind of way. If they have a customer who is not satisfied with the service they receive, the risk is they don't come back, or the news spreads to other customers. And I think, particularly for independent pharmacies, this is a real genuine issue. But so for this example, they say they didn't want to say it's 5 minutes and then the patient sits there for ages, because they're not going to come back. And this was thinking again in the context of a business. They don't want to be losing their customers, put bluntly, and they put it bluntly themselves sometimes as well. The final theme is a kind of an interesting blurring of boundaries between doing the research, and actually their pharmacy practice. So because the recruitment process involved some form filling, and there were the questions about general health, physical and mental health. There are some questions about smoking and exercise, and a bit about drinking, and a kind of a rounded picture of people's health. And they reported that actually discussing those with patients influenced the way the consultation then ensued. So the screening questions, particularly if they were read aloud by the pharmacist, which was often the case, patients tended to prefer that. This meant the pharmacist knew much more about the patient than they would do normally. And so as this pharmacist says, by going through that 5 or 10 minute questionnaire with them, understanding their health needs, in terms of smoking, exercise, etc., that actually provoked some discussion. It changed the way the consultation then continued. And so as people started to talk, before you started the consultation properly, you'd actually felt you got to know a bit more of a rounded individual, and that affected what they then said to the patient. So that was unexpected, and actually it's really important for a trial of this sort, because we'd actually, one implication to this, we'd actually inadvertently altered the service from the usual check of medicines, a cursory check of medicines, into much more of a discussion, actually about the patient's general health, which makes it more like the intervention we were trying to test. So, in both arms of the trial, the intervention arm and the control arm, there was more discussion going on than normal, and that kind of undermines the experimental contrast with usual practice, because we're finding actually that usual practice itself was now different because of the data collection that preceded the consultation. So if we were going to do this again, we could try more intense training, or more time to familiarise and build confidence with the process and the materials for recruiting patients, because this was a real problem for them, and perhaps placing greater emphasis on allowing more time in the medicine review routine in general, allowing more time for the research, to emphasise that when we were recruiting pharmacists in the first place. So at the very least, they're much better prepared for what's to come. And if any of them really find the whole idea impossible, excuse me. Sorry about that. Oh my goodness, it's never happened before. It's absolutely typical. Right, so where was I? Oh yes. So in other words, we could, if we do this again, just wheedle out pharmacists who just found this whole idea just too difficult. So we're kind of giving them a bit more warning that this could be an issue, and some might decide not to take part. But nevertheless, actually, in terms of support we provided, we worked really well with the pharmacists. A really enjoyable experience, and I certainly enjoyed working with them. The final slide. It is clear that this is a time-pressured, business-orientated environment, and it makes undertaking a trial with NHS services really challenging. There's no question about it, and that's clear at every stage of the research. And probably most importantly for us, a single research training day was not sufficient to prepare a group of pharmacists who'd never done research before to take part in a trial and recruit patients. So it's a lot more work than we expected. So if we were to do this again, we would definitely include that early observation of recruitment practice. That made a huge difference to the overall process. And we would say, actually, we want to provide that one-to-one support throughout, not just through the initial recruitment process. We probably want to do it throughout, and I think the pharmacists would appreciate that. And finally, our main conclusion really is that a huge amount can be done nationally. It's to prepare the pharmacy profession for engagement and research. We were really surprised by how difficult they found it, and I think that's probably going to be replicated wherever you go and do a trial or some sort of complex research in a community pharmacy. The standard pharmacist training doesn't involve research, and so you're just relying on ad hoc experiences of people's MAs or whatever they've done in the past. Now, that's not to say trials don't happen in community pharmacy; they do, but maybe at some national level there needs to be some kind of training input, or at least an infrastructure to support the involvement of these healthcare professionals in trials in the future. So I think Michelle and I probably said far too much, actually. So we'll be quiet and open ourselves up to some questions or discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan and Michelle. I think I have my mic on. So yes, we have time for questions. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but I do have many myself. But I'll start with checking the chat box first. Well, I will invite people also to write more questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and if you would like, and to use the mic on. So I'm going through the chat box first. So there was a question, I believe, from Olive saying, with MAC, will pharmacists automatically ask all patients about alcohol use, or only those who clearly have an alcohol problem?
Sure, thank you. And actually, my reply was a bit rushed because actually, currently in
Sure.
routine practice, it's clear that pharmacists think about alcohol as terms of problem drinking. So the way things work now is if one of their patients did ask for advice, or more rarely, if a pharmacist offered advice proactively to a patient who they thought had a problem with their drinking, that might involve some very brief advice about how to cut down, and maybe referral to a GP or another service. That's what happens now. For the MAC and the intervention, the focus isn't on problem drinking, because actually even small amounts of alcohol consumption can really affect the health of this particular population. Older people by and large with chronic conditions, taking often many medications, even small amounts of alcohol can interfere with those treatments and the health. So actually the level of consumption is much lower, that the threshold's much lower. So we discourage talk about problem drinking. There is a role for pharmacists if a patient really is consuming lots of alcohol, and identifies that themselves as a problem. Then that referral pathway function is still very much there.
Yeah, Olive? We cannot hear you, Olive. Again, we cannot hear you. I think you might have, if you would like to type, please, we can pick you up your question there in the chat box. Can I ask you, since Duncan, since you just mentioned this, were part of this trial the intention, or sort of the outcome, to evaluate the effectiveness of the medication taking, and also the adherence in relation to alcohol? I imagine a lot of people will say, I am taking the medication, but I know that alcohol can interfere. So when I take alcohol, I stop taking the medication. So obviously the adherence is not going to be 100%. It will be automatically into the sort of non-adherent side of the spectrum. I wondered if that was something that you intended also to measure in your follow-up or interviews or with patients.
Thank you, Yolanda. That's an excellent question and gets to the heart of probably one of the main sort of enduring issues with this program. So the primary outcome is actually reduced drinking. But at the time we were doing the pilot trial, we did have a co-primary outcome in mind. We weren't quite sure. We wanted a measure to capture a change in the way people are taking their medication, but not adherence per se. Because by and large, adherence measures tend to have a bit of a ceiling effect. In other words, everyone says they adhere. And this has been our experience and experience of others. So for this trial, we piloted a confidence in medications measure, which is really about, it's a broader measure of how patients get on with their medications in practical terms, so they don't miss. It captures some of the issue of adherence, but it's broader than that. It's a kind of a blend of adherence, satisfaction with the medications, and understanding how they work and how they're supposed to take them. To be honest, I'm not entirely convinced that the measure was that great. So I think this is that issue's back on our agenda moving forwards. It's still unresolved. It's actually really hard to kind of nail what it is about medications we'd expect to change, and then how to measure it. So yeah, so it's work in progress, but it is a really important point.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms also in relation to what Michelle was describing, very detailed way the approach to the participant, the people, yeah, the patients, patient participant taking medication, because she was talking about the telephone, right, interviews, and I was wondering, it sounded to me, and I don't know if Michelle want to clarify this, is that you were using some scales. It was rather, or was a space there also for a qualitative aspect to be gathered as well? I don't know.
Thank you.
I wasn't very clear in that point.
The form that I was completed had validated scales in there, and it was interesting because obviously if I was doing them over the telephone, they were different to if they were posted to the person and they were completing them themselves. So that was something that we were aware of as well. But yes, the questions were a measure with various responses on a scale, and there's also the fact that people interpret scales differently was something to consider, and it's something that we've presented in the paper that Duncan showed earlier, is the responses. I'm sorry, actually, I'm not sure. What I was going to say, sorry, I'm not sure if it is in that paper, the different responses based on whether or not patients were completing it by post or by telephone, and the percentage of those. It's really an interesting thing to look at.
Yes.
But yes, both the forms that went out in the post and the forms that were completed over telephone were both the same form. So they were both quantitative measures, and therefore weren't allowing for qualitative responses to be collected.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. I think Olive has a question or a follow-up. She says, what percentage of patients in study demonstrated, one, an alcohol use, and two, moderate alcohol use? significant alcohol use. So she's giving the three options. Yes. Any
Yeah,
alcohol use, moderate alcohol use, or significant alcohol use.
sure. The short answer is I can't give you the precise figures. It is in that paper, but every patient, to be eligible for the trial, every patient has to be consuming alcohol at least twice a week. So they were all, at the very least, moderate drinkers in terms of frequency.
Duncan, I've
Now,
got if you'd like to reiterate the results.
brilliant.
So the frequency of alcohol consumption table as presented in the paper is split into 2 or 3 times a week or 4 times a week or more. So 67% of our participants were drinking 2 or 3 times a week, and 33% were drinking 4 or more times a week. So we're seeing a 2/3, 1/3 split.
Yeah. So I suppose for that was, I suppose, for what you said earlier, Duncan, that was considered to be well, certainly will be affecting the effect of the medication being taken, isn't it?
That's right. And I think, our emphasis here is on frequency of consumption rather than getting into the complication of, the quantities involved. So whilst there's an outcome measure, we measure, Michelle took a 7-day record, actually, what people had consumed. We calculated a quantity frequency measure. For a pharmacist doing a consultation, they haven't got time to be messing around with trying to calculate units. And for this population, it's not so important. What we're interested in really is the regularity with which alcohol could be interfering with people's treatment. And so the idea is really to leave it up to the patient to describe what they think about their drinking and how they, if they identify it as a potential issue or not. And by and large, if you give people the space to do that, they're very capable of perhaps, saying that they themselves are a bit worried about their drinking, or being very open to the possibility that actually they hadn't thought about their drinking alongside their medications in this way before, and now they do so. That actually they get that there could be some issues. For the sort of the cliched, taking your pills at night, the glass of whiskey kind of thing, which in fact did occur in this trial. Some people, that's just the way they do things, and they've never thought about the fact that if you're taking a medication to reduce your blood pressure, so you're taking one drug to do that, and then you're consuming alcohol, another drug, which actually raises your blood pressure. Then you're cancelling the two things out, and this is where the pharmacist comes in, because from the patient's perspective, to hear that kind of explanation from someone who's an expert in pharmaceuticals and drugs lends legitimacy to the general message that actually that's something that the patient should think about. The pharmacist isn't saying, so I think you should cut down, because we don't think that's the most productive way of having this kind of discussion. It's kind of leaving it with the patient to make their own decisions, and then we'll see if they make any changes or not. And just looking at Olive's follow-up question, there are issues with self-reported consumption, absolutely, and particularly the risk being, if you're talking to a healthcare professional, it has an influence potentially on the way what you disclose about your behaviour. So there is always going to be that issue in the background with alcohol consumption in particular. And so we just use standardized measures as far as we could, and beyond equipping pharmacists to ask about alcohol consumption in a sensitive way, in a non-judgmental way, without stigmatizing the patient. Beyond that, I think you just have to trust what the patient's saying.
I think particularly with the follow-up, it might have helped with the fact that I was external to the pharmacy care team, because there was no real need for them to downplay their alcohol consumption, because they knew that the data was never going to be reiterated back to the pharmacy team. They knew that the data wasn't going any further. So you would hope that participants felt reassured that they could talk to me honestly about their alcohol consumption. Excuse me.
Okay, thank you, Michelle and Duncan. I don't know if I have more questions, but
You know what? Can I ask you a lot of questions?
yes.
I'd be interested if any of you who joined the seminar, have an interest, even if it's not necessarily an imminent one, but in doing some research with pharmacists. So that could be in community pharmacy, or maybe in general practice or hospitals, but just working with the profession. I just wonder if anyone's got any plans or interests in that kind of direction.
Well, I do, but
Olive does it.
Says definitely. And you can type, Olive, please. Well, I'm just saying that just listening to all the process, and I think it was really interesting, and I think we are very grateful. Anyone wanting to work with pharmacist role, I suppose you have given us a very deep. You have shared a lot of the backstage. I mean, and how challenging and the multiple challenges you may encounter in trying to run these trials, which of course on a level it might feel a bit daunting in terms of how much of a team and how many procedures and processes, and the fact that the background in research is probably much more or limited in comparison to running a trial in the NHS. And I think I was wondering if you consider running this also, or at some point in a clinical pharmacy, so that new roles that are being trained, that be part of primary care networks, and that new role of also reviewing effective medicine use, if you have something to say around that.
Oh, I have loads, but I'm going to keep it very brief. If you're interested in that particular topic, actually, of how this research is now, we're going to have to try and do this research with clinical pharmacists in general practice now, because the medicine use review is gone.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about this on I think it's the 27th, the final research showcase.
Okay.
So I'm going to. So if anyone's interested in that, come along, because I'm talking a lot more about general practice and how we are transplanting what we've done in community pharmacy, putting it into the mess primary care network, clinical pharmacy. But one thing I should probably add, just very quickly, is that we have benefited a huge amount from consulting with the pharmacy profession themselves. So, this is the pilot trial was a kind of a culmination of lots of smaller studies and lots of workshops and consultations with national pharmacy groups, local pharmacy groups, and the whole intervention was co-produced with pharmacists as well as patients. So we've had a lot of advice, input and guidance from the profession along the way, which has really helped in terms of the way we pitch what we've done. I think that's probably the most important thing. So it's being pitched in a way that pharmacists find attractive, and we've done our best to be guided by pharmacists themselves. So this isn't Michelle and I and colleagues, independent ideas about how to do this in community pharmacy. This is very much a collaboration with community pharmacists and the broader pharmacy profession and the national organisations that underpin that profession. So there's been a lot of work to get to this very small pilot trial. You wouldn't believe it, but it took 18 months, 15 to 18 months to get to the pilot trial of intervention development. But as I say, also the planning and the consultation and getting things, the planned research as honed as possible. So if anyone's interested in doing this from community pharmacy, Michelle and I and our network, are a potential resource for you. So one of the reasons we want to bring this, to these seminars in the centre, primary health and social care, is there is access to some experience and expertise within the centre, and so that is open to you. So that's why I asked, really. So don't be shy about engaging with that if it's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Stewart. Duncan, sorry. I'm just reading the names and I made a mistake. And Michelle, I don't know if we have any further comments from Michelle. Yes, that she has pasted the link to the paper they were referring to. And I think this is the one that Duncan showed us before about the description of the trial.
That's right, yeah.
Yes. At the next seminar, Olive is mentioning the next seminar. I suppose it's yours next seminar coming in on the 27th, where you will be explaining a bit more some sort of future plans, perhaps on how to take this forward in the new aligning with the new NHS long-term plan, presumably, which is where the clinical pharmacies will sit within primary care, I guess. Yes,
that's exactly right. And I should be explaining the sort of messiness and slightly bizarre way the whole thing's unfolded and what that means for our research program.
Brilliant. We'll be there. And yes, Olive also said that it sounds as if there was a great deal of good groundwork for the study. And I think the experience is extremely valuable. Yeah, it has been really, really valuable to get so much detail into what it is involved in running a trial or a pilot for the trial in a pharmacy, community pharmacy. If we don't have, I don't know if any final comments or questions, otherwise we can bring this seminar to a close. Okay. I think we're coming up to time now. I think we have a great session. Thanks everyone for your attendance today, and thanks again to Duncan and Michelle for your great presentation and discussion. And thank you very much, and have, I suppose, a great rest of the day or the evening, everyone. And we are, as Duncan said, invited to his next follow-up presentation on this topic on the 27th of November. I said it wrong. 27th of
January.
Duncan is January. Good. Otherwise, I wanted to have Christmas again. Okay.
That's cool. Well, can I just say thank you to you, Yolanda, for organising this and bringing us all together.
Okay.
Very grateful for that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both very much.